will be introducing you to VITALY, who is here. He is currently the creative lead at Smashing Magazine. He also does front end and UX consultant work in Europe and abroad. He works with European Parliament, Axel Springer, a few other companies like that. VITALY, this is my favorite part of your bio, but it says VITALY loves beautiful content and does not give up easy. So what an awesome kind of spirit to start us off here in our conference this morning. So with all that being said, VITALY, what are you going to be talking to us about today?
Well, I'm actually very much excited to speak about some of the frustrations that we get on the web these days. And of course, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the session. Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction as well. I'm very much looking forward to this talk, actually. A lot of frustration on the web. It's time to fix it.
Could not agree more. All right, let's talk timing briefly. I believe we've got you for about 45 minutes and then a nice little Q&A portion for 10 minutes afterwards. So please, people, as you're hearing VITALY speak such knowledge and such wonderful, exciting things, pop your questions in the Q&A chat and I'll make sure to head over there and grab a few of them. We can pop them to our speaker here shortly. So take it away, VITALY.
That sounds exciting. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Very, very happy to be kind of looking into this wonderful, wonderful world of frustration that we get on the web. It's kind of ironic, to be honest, that we are speaking about frustrating design patterns at the opening of the Amuse conference, because most of the time those frustrating experiences are not very amusing, but we need to get them right. And this is kind of what I want to take you on a journey with today, to kind of look into where are we actually in terms of design, where are we in terms of experience, where are we in terms of the web. I mean, many of us had a little bit of time on our hands last year, and I tried to use this time to understand what is not so well not so well designed, let's say, on the web, and how we can make it a bit better. And so this is kind of the story that I want you to kind of join me with today. And it really starts somewhere where we all are at some point. It starts at a point where we are working on a project, and in that project, we need to start somewhere and we need to finish because we have a deadline coming in. And so most of the time, we're kind of maneuvering our way, trying to find our path towards that completion, and we start and we keep refining and we keep improving and so on and so forth until we actually hit that finish button or the finish area on the line, and then we're done. Now, in reality, most of the time, this experience of us designing things doesn't work in this way. It's not a very linear path. Most of the time, we are very much constrained by very different boundaries, be it the expertise we have in-house, be it the number of people that are working on a project, finances, legacy, all kind of things that are kind of on our way. So we can't really just do whatever we want. We're in a way forced to do certain things in a certain way because they used to work in the past. And so we are maneuvering through these tunnels, trying to make those really difficult decisions very often to find a way forward. And very often, we're going to be kind of trying many different things, and then, oh, it didn't work, so I'm going to try something else. Oh, it doesn't work, so I'm going to try something else. And so there is a lot of moving back and forth until we actually have something that we think, okay, this is probably going to work well. And this is why we kind of ended up in this world where many things look very similar. And I asked myself for a long period of time, is it actually a bad thing? Or is it a good thing? This is a famous tweet that have been making rounds in the community for a while, which one of these two possible websites are currently designing, because there is only the one on the left and there is the one on the right, and that's pretty much it. This is the end of the story. And so where are we then today? Like, what do we need to keep in mind when we're designing? When we look around, most of the time, the experiences are actually not great. So this is one of them. And I wondered, how is it, or how did we come to this world where this is kind of accepted to be normal? We don't go to the streets to protest against, pop-ups and newsletter boxes appearing all over the place. We just take it. We just accept it. We're just used to it, which I think is a very, very dangerous proposition in the first place. So how did we end up here in the first place? So this is just a state of things, but then it gets worse, right? It gets much worse. I know that Trina is going to speak next, and she brought up this example many, many, many years ago of Ryanair and the experiences we get to enjoy on Ryanair. And I'm like an elephant. I never forget what happened on Ryanair, because when you were booking a flight with Ryanair, an insurance was added in for you automatically. Now, you could opt out from that insurance if you knew how to opt out. But to opt out, you would need to find "Don't insure me" conveniently located between Denmark and Finland in the selector, country selector, when you're checking out. This is just not nice. This is not just disrespectful and horrible in so many ways, right? But this is just, business decision. And what we saw previously is just, these are how things are working when we don't have any priorities in place, when the UX process is not in place. So you also end up with slightly different things like this. This is interesting because this is just a form. What's big deal about form? We've been designing forms for 20 years now, or even more. There is a problem with this form though. And the problem is that it took me 53 seconds to type in my date of birth. Now, normally, if I ask you, you'll probably have an exact number in mind of what your date of birth is. It's not like something you need to look up. Was it Saturday when I had my birthday? Friday? I don't remember anymore. These are 8 digits. And the fastest way and the easiest way to provide your birthday would probably be, to just type it, which is not possible in this particular UI, and it's not keyboard accessible either. Not to mention, of course, this being just a very typical frustration we get on the web, but not to mention these beauties. I mean, we don't see them that much anymore, right? These beautiful, beautiful captures, because they are now disguised in a slightly different shape and form of, I don't know, go ahead and identify crosswalks and traffic lights and fire hydrants. That's essentially what we are doing now every single day. So how on earth did we end up there, right?
Am I supposed to be seeing something on the screen?
Oh, yes, of course. You do not? Oh, so
you're so, I mean, you're describing it so well that I almost didn't know, but.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize.
Just to check.
Yes, of course. And this was
this
broadcasted
is
to everybody,
Thank you.
right? Oh, wow. I'm so sorry, dear friends. So now, oh, this is just unbelievable. First time it happens to me, but that's okay. So, all right. But I hope that you got at least parts of it. So here's an example I was showing previously, right? Wait, why did we come to this site in the first place, right? Like, how did we end up in this world? This is not quite something where we want to be, right? And this is the infamous example of Ryanair, where again, we have this beautiful select drop down, and then you have don't insure me between Denmark and Finland. This is not the greatest experience either, right? And then this is actually this birthday selector where it takes literally 53 seconds for me to type in the date of birth, right? Which is pretty much not the best experience we could provide, right? And if we look around, those kind of widgets actually, those kind of calendar pickers widgets, they are everywhere. Every time we need to zoom out and we're going to need to explore the month and the year and then the day and then the week and all those things. And it's kind of all over. And again, not to mention this beauty that now has turned into this, right? Which is something that we need to do now every single day, it feels, right? So that feels a little bit off. So I started interviewing people. To try to categorize and kind of create this catalog of things that don't work well and things that we need to do better as a community. Because when I was teaching at the University of Amsterdam, actually 2020, just before everything happened, I was just talking to students trying to understand how do they see the web. I mean, I remember vividly how excited I was, FTPing all the way, creating this kind of rainbow GIFs and all the things that you hopefully don't remember, right? But I was excited about the web. I was deeply excited. I thought that this is the best thing ever. And obviously, like 30 years or 20 years have passed now of us using it actively, so this excitement faded away. But it shouldn't be like that, because we still should be excited about these opportunities we get on the web. So what I was hearing back was not very exciting to me. People don't like tiny scrollable panes where you have maybe this little filter area in a commerce site for brands, and it's like 40 pixels tall, and you have to scroll all the way down until you hit it. That's annoying. Tiny click targets when you have this little checkbox, and it's really hard to uncheck or check. Whenever things move all of a sudden, whenever menus open on hover and not on click on tap, we'll look into it in a moment. Country selector drop down, poor Netherlands. If you happen to be from the Netherlands, you never know where to search for yourself. Is it going to be, the Netherlands, Holland, kind of prioritized on the top, or maybe kind of downgraded to the bottom because you're not a very popular customer? You never know. So this is a journey. Generic error messages that do not communicate anything, unsupported back button that just doesn't work properly. This is why people are afraid of the back button, especially in e-commerce. Next buttons that don't really work when you need them. This is just an experience I had today. Imagine, I mean, I'm sure that most of you had this experience before. I did literally an hour ago. You're booking anything, you're booking, buying a ticket. And for some reason, the shipping address that you, or ticket or buying a book or whatever, the shipping address that you're providing, right, for the invoice or for delivery does not match against the records that the validator has, right? So the interface will tell you, no, you're wrong. But I know that I'm right because I've been living in this place for 2 years. So of course I'm right, but the interface will just block you. This happens when the next buttons are disabled. There is no way to enable them. This is how we lose customers. This is also why we're frustrated about it. Filters that don't really act all the time. Imagine again, e-commerce scenario where you maybe want to book to buy a t-shirt or so, and you have color and size and a few other things that you want to define. And every time you click on a filter somewhere, the entire UI freezes. And even if, sometimes part of the UI are enabled, once you tap a couple of times, only one of those inputs is registered. And so you have to wait and then type or tap again. Frustrating tooltips that cover the input. Sometimes it's very difficult to type in exact value to be very specific with the text input in sliders. Password that's too hard, and it keeps going and going and going and going. By the end, we just sit there and cry because most of the time the experience is just not great. So let's take a look at some of them and try to fix them. And we'll start with the thing that I think excites us all, or maybe not. I'm not quite sure. That would be carousels. I'm very excited to hear or to see in the chat how many of you are big fans of carousels. So if you are a fan of a carousel, please write +++ in the chat. That would be really exciting to see. And if you do not like carousels, - would be appropriate as well. Okay, I'm going to sit on it for a second. So carousels don't have a good reputation, do they? No, although there is no reason for it. When we look at these carousels, look how beautiful they can be. This is a beautiful illustration by Jackie Gilbertson. And we have two carousels, one on the top and one at the bottom, right? And they're beautiful. Well, they can be. However, most of the time when we design a carousel experience, this is not going to be a good experience. Why? Well, because most of the time when we're looking into carousels, this is what they look like. We have an arrow on the left, we have an arrow on the right, and then we have the dots in between indicating the progress. Right? This is the carousel pattern that most of us, I think, are used to, right? So this is kind of it. Well, when we look into the data, though, especially this particular case, will tell us that, well, that's probably not the best way to design a carousel. Why? Because people don't click through. This is one of the famous studies that was done back in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and then repeated 2017. And this is what the results are like. Position 1 of the carousel, or the first image, is seen by a lot of people, but position 2, 3, 4, 5 get 2 to 3% at most, right? And this is why we've been kind of saying, well, we should not use carousel. I mean, we have to use carousels for marketing reasons every now and again, but we don't want to use carousels because they don't work. Well, that's not quite right, because they don't all look the same. So when we compare this experience with a slightly different experience, you'll see that you can actually make them better and perform better as well. And when I talk about performance, by the way, I think it's very important. My job most of the time, when I'm kind of hired to do anything, is not to improve padding of buttons or make buttons prettier or, I don't know, improve the layout of things. My job is to make sure that I can create experiences, I can improve experiences to drive business metrics while also improving UX. So it's kind of both. And I'm not just saying, oh, this carousel doesn't look nice, we need to make it look a bit nicer. No, what I'm saying here, how can we make this carousel work better to drive business metrics and also improve user experience along the way, right? Very often they are interconnected and it's really not necessary to decouple them at all. So how can we do that? Well, we start looking around. When you look around in Turkey, for example, you will find that most of the carousels will look very different. You will never find these dots that we're so used to, right? And I ask myself, why? I mean, it goes to extremes at times where you get, sometimes 25 different slices of a carousel. And, it's really consistently used across all kind of Turkish sites. So you go to another one, you see numbers all over again at the bottom, right? There are no dots indicating kind of slices of the carousel. There are numbers. And go to another one. This is my favorite. You get all of them combined. You have a little horizontal carousel at the bottom, then you have a vertical left next to it, then you have one with thumbnails on top, and then you have another content slider in the right upper corner, kind of a gallery of carousels, if you like, right? So why are they doing it this way? And when I started interviewing people, I realized that numbers are useful. Can you guess why? Well, because they give us a point of reference. I can text somebody and say, hey, look at slice number 3, right? Or look at slice number 7 or 11, right? So that's already maybe a little bit better, but that's probably not quite what we want. We can take it to the next level even further, right? One thing that we need to keep in mind is to kind of create a very clear path for people to move a carousel, because sometimes it's not very obvious. So when we look here at uandall.eu, right, we see this little component on the left, and normally people will try to actually drag it vertically, because this is, the affordance. It kind of appears as if it was draggable vertically. Well, it is not, because in order to swipe the carousel, you need to swipe it horizontally, and then we show the kind of with an indicator where we are. That's a bit confusing just because we don't have a mapping, a one-to-one clear mapping between how you move and what is going to happen as you're moving that carousel, right? Even if it's taking the full background color, I think that many people will not even know that you can drag it. They'll be confused that this button doesn't work as expected, right? But then it goes to the next level, because if you actually explore e-commerce sites, you'll find that carousels, even the one with the dots actually, can work really well. And especially on the e-commerce sites, you will find that the click-through rates are actually very high. There is a very good reason why most hotel booking websites will have plenty of images, up to 60 or 70, and they have a very high click rate. Because if you're booking a vacation, you really do not want to leave anything to chance. You want to make sure that what you're looking at in a hotel, maybe it's a gym, maybe it's a spa, maybe it's breakfast or anything in between, is represented properly, so you know what you're going to get, right? This is very, very important. So this is why you will see slightly different kind of click-through rates there, right? And it keeps going not only for the decay that we're going to see here, right, in terms of click-through rate, but also the viewing, incremental carousel slides, and how often people do that. So it's kind of different compared based on the experience you're creating and you're providing, right? All right. So how can we then get there, right? Get to the point where people are using carousels more. First thing is, if you have a auto-rotating carousel, the one major accessibility requirement is to include a pause button. That's very important, not only for accessibility, but also when people focus on a particular slice of a carousel, they need time to take it all in. And the rotation of the carousels, if you do have an auto-rotating one, which we ideally would avoid, right? If you do need one, just make sure that you let it be for at least 7 seconds, both on mobile and on desktop, so people have actually the chance to perceive it. Because if it's scrolling too fast, people just dismiss it altogether. And that's definitely not what we want to achieve, right? Another thing we can do is maybe replace these dots with something else, like, for example, just the horizontal line at the bottom, right? It does the same thing, because it indicates where you are and what the progress is and how much you need to scroll. It's not as precise, but then you complement it with some arrows, which kind of allow you to jump in a predictable way. And also these buttons, these steppers that you saw, right? They're quite large, so they're easy to tap and they're easy to click, right? So that's a bit better. We can even take it to the next level one more time, because what if we actually replace those labels, the dots, with something like useful, meaningful, contextual labels, like digitalization, innovation, partnerships. And here, this is a beautifully designed carousel, full page carousel experience. And even the slice as the video is playing is changing. So it shows you how long the video is going to play. And you hover over one of the slices and you actually get, again, a label, an explanation of what you should be expecting when you tap on that thing. And this is what it looks like on mobile, right? I mean, obviously you will not be able to move everything by 90 degrees, right? But you could move it by maybe 45 degrees, and maybe you could actually show 3 or 4 instead of 5, but you're gonna get the idea. Just replacing labels with some dots with something that's a bit more contextual. Or even take it to the next level and maybe turn each individual dot into some sort of like a tab, as you can see here on the top, right? Where you have the labels, it's very obvious where you're navigating, and you have also kind of auto rotation by default when you actually land on the page, but it's infinitely more useful than just having 2 arrows on the left and on the right and dots in between. right? So maybe this would be one of the better options to do that. Or further, why don't we replace these dots with thumbnails, right? Thumbnails probably a bit more, actionable and a bit more engaging compared to the previous example, right? And again, we mentioned already arrows, and these are the things that kind of keep me awake at night, really. So when you think about these arrows, and here on the Graham website, Art Museum Graham, you see that this arrow is allocated on the top, right? And so as we are navigating the carousel, we kind of have to click on these arrows to navigate it, or we can also swipe, of course. So the question then would be, where do you put these arrows? Do you keep them above our images or our products, whatever it is that we're showing or showcasing? Do we put it in the middle, kind of vertically aligning them on the images, or do we put them below, right? And this is something that really kept been bothering me for quite some time, so I decided to do some research. And the best example I could find that worked just beautifully and wonderfully well, really well in usability test was this one. This is my reference example for any kind of carousel experience I would suggest to anybody to design, right? First of all, we get the arrows. They are large. They're not even, 44 times 44. They're more like 55 times 55 pixels, right? And they're located above those thumbnails or images first on desktop. As we then go to the smaller screen, though, their position will change, as you will see in a moment, right? But again, even if you scale down, these buttons are really large. They really are large. But on mobile, they jump to the bottom, right? And that's very important because when you are on a mobile device, the only way for you to avoid people lifting their finger to read the content when they navigate the carousel is to put those arrows below the images and not above them and not on the images. This is a really great way to minimize people taking time to consume that content and slowing them down, right? Instead, we can actually speed them up by allowing them to tap back and forth very, very quickly so they can navigate there this way. A really wonderful example right here, right? And here's another one, right? Where you can integrate those arrows beautifully. So even if you're moving left and right, you have this little background effect thing coming up. Actually, it is a carousel, right? But it's an infinitely better one. It really is better designed, right? So when you think about better carousels, I just challenge you to test what will happen if you remove the dots altogether. Will it be noticed at all? If not, well, maybe there's a way to replace them with something else. If it's necessary to use them, make them larger so people will feel comfortable tapping them. Test what happens if you replace kind of a little progress indicator, just a horizontal line at the bottom. Also test what happens if you replace them with something more contextual, like thumbs, tabs, labels, things like that. If you have a vertical carousel, then maybe instead of using a carousel, use arrows or buttons to indicate directions. On desktop, we could place the buttons above the slices or above those images, and on mobile below. And also make sure that these labels or buttons feel like a part of the carousel. They're not too far away from those images. And if you have auto rotation, please always add a pause button for those carousels. And always keep in mind, the carousel should not rotate automatically faster than 5-7 seconds at a time, right? That's a very important consideration to keep in mind. So I hope with that in mind, I made you fall in love with some carousels. And if I didn't, here is one of them that I will never forget. Just look at this beautiful little navigation, probably one of the best websites I've seen for years. And this is a puppet theater website from Poland. And they have, I think, here somewhere, let me see if I have it. Yes, this little carousel, right? We can swipe through the different options that they have, different types of exhibitions, things like that. Just beautifully, beautifully designed and fits well within the scope of what they have, right? Just really well designed. All right, let's take the next one. And that one is going to be a bit mean compared to the previous one. Namely, let's talk about our good old friend, Infinite Scroll. I think that most of us do not appreciate Infinite Scroll for very good reasons, actually, because Infinite Scroll, when we think about it, seems to have all the problems in the world, and why would ever anybody want to use it? Well, there are good reasons to use it. Why? Well, let's see. First of all, why do we use Infinite Scroll in the first place? Well, most of the time when we want to highlight products and want to show products, if we take, or any kind of items really. So if we take some sort of a general, typical e-commerce site, right? Normally a very common scenario experience would be pagination. So you have maybe on a sales page 47 pages, and you keep going and you keep paginating forward, and you're going from one page to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. That's option number one. Option number two is, that infamous infinite scroll. You scroll and you scroll and you keep scrolling and you keep scrolling and you keep scrolling, and eventually, if you're lucky, you hit the footer just because they ended up, they don't have any products anymore to show, right? That's number two. And number three is kind of a combination, I guess, where you have a load more pattern. So if you look at the scroll bar on the right, as you start scrolling here, and you scroll and you scroll and you scroll, eventually the scroll bar gets smaller, right? So actually gets bigger. So you see more products loaded in. This is infinite scrolling play, and then eventually you replace it with this load more pattern, a lot more products. We click on load more, and off we go. We then end up loading more products, and we keep going, right? So I'm wondering in the chat if you could write which one of these do you prefer personally? Would you kind of opt in for pagination, or for load more, or for infinite scroll? I'm very, very curious to hear what you think. So please write one of them in the chat if you can, right? But in general, all of them have some downsides, right? When looking at pagination, it is the most popular one, but it's also the slowest solution. Users usually browse significantly less because every time they click on a page, they need to all kind of go from top to bottom, and then they need to click, and then they go from top to bottom. So they feel slowed down. You will hear people saying this all the time. Why is it so slow? Although the experience is not necessarily slow, but it feels like they always need to wait. Why? Well, when they click on page 2, we need some time to send them to the page 2 where they get all the results and all of that. So that takes time. But with pagination in place, users spend more time on the first page and also use filter sorting more. So if you have very complicated products which require a lot of customization, let's say, then maybe it's not a bad idea at all to use pagination, because people will be taking a lot of time to explore this particular page. All right. With infinite scroll, people have issues, obviously. It's the most overwhelming option for a very simple reason. People really scan quickly and they scroll quickly and they explore many items quickly as well, but they focus much less on single items in that list. So it's like, okay, let me scroll, and eventually, of course, they click the links and open things in new tabs and so on. And once they reach a certain point, they just close it. So it's really dismissed, right? However, very often you end up with a situation where you feel like it's totally out of control and you cannot reach footer. And actually, these two options, or these two problems, can be easily solved, right? Like easily solved. The footer issue is the easiest of them all. This is a Malaysian food delivery service, and I don't know how I ended up there, but they have just a sticky footer section. So you can always, at any point of time, open the footer and access it, right? Also, they included a skip to footer link in the header of the page. So if you're using assistive technology, you can get there immediately without even scrolling at all, right? Which is great. Problem with footer solved. Or even better, here's another example from Poland, right? As you start scrolling here, again, they do not show anything. But at some point, when you reach certain threshold, right, they show this little footer at the top, the bottom, and not only the footer, but also pagination, right? So if you prefer to use pagination instead, you can do that, right? If you prefer to access the footer, you can do that. If you want to jump to the top of the page, well, you can do that as well, right? So all of this is kind of an extension, I guess, of the previous example, the footer problem solved, right? The other thing that actually shows up as well, you might not be able to see it in the URL at the top, but as you start scrolling down here, they actually change the URL at the top as well using the history API in the browser. So you can actually click on the back button and you will get to page 3 and 4. So kind of navigating through pages, and it also gives people kind of a shareable link that they can actually link to themselves and continue navigating. So they are not really out of control anymore, right? They do have control now. The only thing that doesn't show up here is that it would be nice to have maybe a little button saying, hey, copy the link so you continue navigating later, right? But that's already, problem solved. And the best thing that really works well is to combine infinite scroll and load more. When I say works best, I mean not only usability, obviously, but also the actual business metrics. So with load more, the idea is this. You actually show 10 to 30 products at a time. So if you're on a mobile device, you're going to see 10 products at a time. If you're on a desktop, you're going to see only 30 products at a time. You start scrolling, on one of those devices. If you're on mobile, you have this infinite scroll where you load 10 more and maybe then 10 more, right? On desktop, you do the same thing, but you do it in the 30 increments, 30 products, then 30 products, right? Eventually, you hit a threshold. A threshold, again, mobile maybe 30, on desktop maybe 70 products. And once you hit that threshold, you actually include a load more button, right? When the user clicks on that load more button, you include enough white space between what the customers already have seen and what they will see next. And you also could include some sort of a button in the middle saying, hey, here's a copy, shareable link that you can copy to send it to your colleagues or friends or use it on your own. And also at the same time, you're changing the URL. So when people are using back button, well, they are returning to the previous page, right? And sometimes I saw this one implementation where you actually would have, once you have an infinite scroll in place, when more products are loaded, there is also a little bit of white space to indicate that you're actually, dear user, moving between pages, right? So that kind of combines everything in one. And that seems to be working fairly well. You can also try to do something a bit more experimental, like they do here in Poison Drop in Russia, where the idea is, as you start scrolling down, right? Eventually, let me just jump, hold on. So start scrolling down, right? You will see that at the very bottom, they actually have pagination, infinite scroll, and also load more, right? So very similar to what we had with the Polish example, right? Polish website. You can show more in page, right? Or you can just click on page 2 and then you're going to be moved to another page. So you kind of choose what you want to do, which I think is really fantastic, right? And in all of these examples, one thing is often missing, and that's an option to be able to paginate ahead or scroll ahead, right? Or load ahead. And this is coming from a wonderful eye tracking institute called Baymert Institute from Denmark, from Copenhagen. And they were doing a lot of testing, especially in e-commerce. And one idea that I saw them doing was absolutely incredible. And I have never seen it implemented pretty much anywhere. And I would love it to be everywhere. And so the idea is, if you have a service where you have a lot of items, a lot of products, doesn't matter how well designed it is, filters, search, sorting, and all the things in between. One thing that you could do to improve things is maybe including some labels that people can jump to. So once you have a scroll bar, even if you have infinite scroll, people could be able to jump directly to the point of interest, right? You know, maybe I'm looking for a shirt that costs around $100, right? So they can actually know how to jump better, right? The same thing could be used also for pagination, right? Where you just show this price ranges, so it's more obvious, again, where people are going to click towards, right? So with all this in mind, in general, I would say there is nothing wrong with all of these options, but actually if you combine infinite scroll, pagination, and loading more at once, you'll have pretty much decent results really quickly. So that's something to keep in mind. I hope I let you fall in love with infinite scroll now as well. All right. Okay, I have no idea how I'm doing on time because I did waste the first 3 minutes or so, Katie.
Maybe 10, 15 minutes.
Excellent. Well, then I'm going to fill them in for sure. All right. Well, another thing that always also shows up, and that's the one that I've been really, really annoyed by, is the notion of disabled buttons. And I have been having this conversation with teams almost every other week because I feel like this is so expensive for businesses. Disabled buttons are extremely expensive for businesses, and we don't even measure it. And that's really, really devastating. And again, I'm not talking about disabled UIs. I mean, again, when we're looking into complicated experiences, like in enterprise or in e-commerce, where you get all kind of items and eventually you hit a filter and the entire page freezes and you cannot do that. That's not quite what I'm looking at. What I'm actually speaking about are things like maybe this, right? Just a typical pop-up. Maybe there is a transaction that you're sending money to somebody, right? And the button at the bottom right is disabled because, well, you haven't submitted all the right data yet, right? And sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but sometimes it's really, really damaging. So if we look into this, for example, as an example, this is a UI that's coming from Sweden. I think it's a Sweden train system website. And yes, we have a disabled button, as you hopefully can see at the bottom right. It says fortsätt, and that means continue. Now, you cannot click on it, right? And so obviously you need to do something. in order to continue. And once you click somewhere, specifically, you are selecting one of the ticket types, the time and the class, second class or first class. Well, then the button comes to life, and then you can actually click on it, right? This is a very typical thing. Now, it's really important to understand what happens when people experience this. And I think that this is a very missing kind of part of the story. I think that's very often we just accept that and we just use it. But this is a massive cause for frustration very often. Remember the thing that I mentioned earlier? You type in your shipping address and you're being told this is wrong, but you know that this is right. But as a result, you cannot proceed. Well, the same thing happens on the same scale here as well, right? Not particularly on this particular site. I wasn't really working on that site. But I decided to just run some tests to see, am I just alone thinking that this is a problem or not? So here's what happens when people experience a disabled state. The first thing is, whenever it comes to disabled UI, people understand that something is missing or something is happening in the system, right? Whenever they encounter a disabled button, not the entire UI, first thing they do is slow down massively. This is almost kind of coming to halt, kind of hitting the wall, right? They don't understand what happens, so they search for error messages. If there are no error messages, they look for the usual suspects. So they start playing with input fields. They start removing white spaces, removing special characters, removing wrong formatting or anything like that, just to please the system, right? Then if that doesn't work either, they start scanning from top to bottom, going through every single field, sometimes deleting input, retyping it again, then deleting it again, then retyping it again, and that takes a lot of time, right? And so they actually go for the entire form, and if they field by field and they cannot detect a problem, they just leave. I mean, what else are they supposed to do? And this is extremely expensive, right? And so for the companies who use that and who rely on it, they rely most of the time on an impeccable, accurate, 100% reliable inline validation that just doesn't exist, right? There is no 100% reliable inline validation, as we'll see in a moment. Things will always go wrong. And those people who are going to encounter this situation, they have no chance but leaving. And this is where you just leave people out of the wood, hoping that they will figure it out on their own. And this is where we could pick them up, because we could provide them service and actually, maybe turn them into customers. So here's an example of that. On WeTransfer, it's a wonderful service that I use quite frequently. And I guess there was a glitch, hopefully temporary glitch, where you would add your files and upload a file, and then you can make it, share it with somebody else, right? And so I would be using this interface, and there is no way for me to proceed. I'm trying to upload. I clicked, maybe I had my 50 rage clicks at this point. There is absolutely nothing I can do in order to make it work, and I couldn't. So I had to leave. This is the only thing I could do, right? So the problem with disabled buttons is that they do not explain what is wrong. Sometimes people are wondering what is missing. They don't understand it. Also, disabled buttons are not focusable and very hard to read as they're grayed out. And with enabled buttons, at least we can better highlight all the errors, as Adam Silver said, who published the book Informed Design Patterns on Smashing, right? So that doesn't mean, though, that we should always avoid disabling buttons. Sometimes it's absolutely important and critical. Like, for example, when you send the money to somebody or there is a transfer, you don't want to send the money twice or convert money twice, right? If you want to prevent people from making critical mistakes, we probably want to avoid, keeping button enabled at all times. So we need to turn it into disabled button and stop listening to click events anyway. The same thing happens when you add something to cart. You probably don't want multiple items of the same thing in the cart, right? So sometimes they can be very, very useful one way or the other, but most of the time they can be very, very dangerous. So if you want to make them better, disabled buttons, well, there are different ways of doing that, right? For example, one thing is to say, maybe we can actually communicate something useful when people hover over the button, right? So we can say, you know what, you cannot add to cart here, mostly because you need to add between 1 and 9 tickets. But because we're using a disabled attribute in HTML, this button is not focusable. So if you're using a keyboard only, or if you're using a screen reader, there is no way for you to access it. However, you could also do this, right? Where you actually avoid disabled and use area disabled instead. As you can see here, we have the button that is focusable now. You can actually focus on add to cart. It communicates the message of what is missing and what needs to be fixed. It also indicates to the screen reader that this button is dimmed, right? And how to actually fix that or how to avoid these kind of situations. That's already much better. That's much more inclusive. right? And in the end, of course, the ideal scenario would be to just avoid disabled buttons and communicate errors immediately when the button is enabled, when somebody clicks on that button, right? And a good way of doing that would be something like this, or maybe something like this, where I show a little bit of a hint, a popover comment or so. Somebody clicks on that button and you say, hey, here is an error, please fix it, right? But that still doesn't solve that problem that people might not be able to fix the error, because there is no error, because my shipping address, for example, is absolutely correct. So if I go back here, right, and I look specifically at the disable button at the bottom, maybe for your UI, and I challenge you to just test it, I don't know, for half a day on a Saturday when there is not much traffic, just test what happens if you add a little bit of a label or microcopy below it saying, hey, you cannot proceed, choose the journey first, kind of indicating to the user what they need to do to fix that problem, to continue, to kind of enable the continue button. So they click on choose a journey first, and you focus on the area which they need to act on and maybe provide a hint of what exactly they need to do, right? That's maybe a bit better already. Or here's another story that I tried. What if you write, can't proceed, let us know, we'll email you shortly. Now, when they click on let us know, a modal shows up. In that modal, we only ask for the email address or phone number, depending on how what kind of clients you have. And so as I type in the email address, you also write that all the information that you already have typed in the form is going to be sent to the customer support. And because you cannot proceed, we'll reach out and we'll help you resolve this issue in no time, 24 hours or whatever, right? That at least gives a chance to people who are working in the company to pick up those customers who would be abandoning 100% because they cannot buy the ticket at all, right? That's already a bit better. And maybe, again, I challenge you to test what happens if you do this, right? There seem to be errors in your input, and you can link directly to the errors as you think, or the assistant thinks they are errors, right? But if you're sure, please proceed. And I just want to measure how many people will submit extremely noisy and incorrect and inaccurate data, right? And how many people did we lose previously, right? Just because our validator is too aggressive, right? So measure and then figure out if you actually need to do this or not. I mean, not everybody can pull this off, right? But at least maybe you can actually try to make something like this work. But I know that you're thinking, well, we don't have this kind of problem really, because we have, again, a reliable, decent inline validation. Well, there is no such thing. I think that most of you had this experience in the past where you start typing and maybe you typed in, made an error in the first input field. So you jump to the next, you realize that you made a mistake in the first field. So you jump out to the first input field to fix it. And then you're being penalized twice, although you didn't even have a chance to type in a single character, right? And this is not necessarily a nice experience because you're being penalized all the time without actually having made a big mistake. And then sometimes editing that wrong input field is very, very hard as well. There are three kinds of inline validation: premature, immediate, and late. Premature validation is whenever somebody just taps on the input field and you show them, hey, you made a mistake. That's not nice. That's not friendly. That's not great. Immediate validation happens when you start typing and there is a certain threshold maybe, and you validate as somebody types. But they will be making mistakes along the way, maybe, likely. And so every time they type, you will have to show them something and they'll have a flash of errors showing up, right? Very late, very early, kind of annoying and frustrating customers along the way. And then finally, you also get late validation, where somebody is leaving the field and you communicate to them, hey, you made a mistake, go back. All of these options interrupt users either too early or too late. And what I learned in a hard way, I guess, is that people don't like it unless they do everything right, right? That's funny. So if they fill in all the forms correctly and there is green check marks everywhere, they love it. But the moment errors start showing up, they are frustrated like hell, right? So sometimes they would hit refresh to get rid of all the errors and retype everything, right? But that's not the point, especially when we often keep the data persistent as they are filling in the form. So how can we fix it? Well, one way of doing this would be to be very, 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 very specific about every single inline validation for every single input field. So for every input, you set a minimum threshold. Once that threshold is reached, you start validating. If there is an error, you show it immediately as you detect it. You show success only if the user has moved to the next input field. If they edit a field that was valid, we validate after data entry, so after they leave the field, because we don't want to annoy them. And if the field was invalid, we validate during data entry, so we reward them fast about fixing of those errors, right? That's, for example, could be an option, right? But still, that means that we need to make sure the validation works, and it will not, because you have too aggressive validators for address, phone numbers, and emails. These are just the things that I encountered last year. There are services that require only Gmail address or require only specific country. Sometimes you have the situation where the input is optional, but empty strings are not accepted. You have non-conforming or non-standardized text numbers or application numbers, reference numbers between countries, and so on. You have anti-spam protection on some systems. You have tracking blockers. You have browser extensions that block input. You have reliance on IP. You have VPN in use. You have all kind of things, right? Which will your validation fail. And we need to make sure that people who fail on our inline validation can proceed. And it can be easily up to 4% of people, right? And we don't usually even measure it because, it's just abandonment rate, right? So this is actually very important. And this is something I try to argue with most of the time, because if you do not measure it, right, you might end up with a lot of money that's being spent or being lost, actually not spent, for no good reason, right? So if I would always argue that maybe if we want to provide a slightly better disabled button, that's a lot of work, but we can make it work. I'm not going to read all of that, but this is a lot of work, a lot of technical work. And I don't know about you, I don't like when to do unnecessary work. So maybe a slightly simpler way of doing this would be to just, avoid inline validation altogether, right? And maybe replace it with just the enabled button, maybe using positive inline validation if we're absolutely certain that the input is correct, but avoid disabled submit buttons, keep them enabled at all times. When people click on them, indicate what is the problem and how to fix it with proper error messages and error summary and things like that. Also, of course, always validate on the server as well, right? Because it's kind of ironic, but one thing that happens quite frequently, people think that all the input is correct. So they have all the green check marks and all. Then there is server validation happening and they're being told that they made a mistake. So all of a sudden, it turns out that the interface has lied to them because it told them that it was okay, but it is not, right? So what happens then, people are just becoming less trustworthy of the UI and also of the brand. Probably don't want that to happen as well. And as you show your error messages, it's a good idea to show them above input fields, not below input fields, and also complement them with warning icons, right? That's probably the best we can do about disabled buttons at this point. Avoid them if we can, because this is going to be quite expensive in production, right? Katie, you need to tell me how much time I have left. I keep going forever.
Minutes or so, we'll have some good,
excellent,
good chunk of time to ask some questions.
Excellent. So these are just a few examples of things that can go wrong and will go wrong. There is obviously plenty more. I think in the beginning I was thinking that this would be just, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 thing. Now it's 29, and it kind of keeps going. But I also learned that if you ask people what they appreciate, the usual suspects will come up. There is nothing magical going on there. For example, people appreciate when things are fast and accessible, when you have a large and legible text, large checkboxes, input boxes that look like input boxes. So they have a border and they're easy to type in, focus states and active states, simple password requirements, predictable tabbing in with the keyboard, error messages that actually help, smart autocomplete, user input that's persisted on refresh. So whenever you hit accidentally refresh or maybe close the window, the data still persists even after that. Drop down that opens on tap and click, not hover. That's a separate conversation for another day. Easy undos, edits and cancellations. So for example, whenever you do something like deleting a database or so, that's a very expensive operation, or newsletter list or things like that. Just make sure that people still can recover from this within 5 minutes after they did that. So an easy option to undo is very important as well. Predictable back button, being able to snooze notifications so you're not overwhelmed by them. Also pausing subscriptions. Very often you're either subscribed to something or you're not, but maybe you just don't want to use it for a couple of months. You just want to keep all the history. So think about the pausing subscription for a couple of months and transparent pricing. If we have all of those things in our UIs, then you'll make many people very, very, very happy, right? right? So just to wrap up, I want to kind of finish very briefly. So 2 more minutes, Katie. Just saying that, when we think about those things, we usually think that this is boring, like large legible text, large checkboxes, input boxes that look like input boxes, and focus states and so on. Well, it doesn't have to be boring at all. It's all about how you frame your story. Even something as boring and horrible maybe as a pop-up can look beautiful. This is probably the best pop-up I've seen in my life, and I wish every single website had it. It's so frustrating, annoying, and difficult. I really like it. There is no way not to like it. I think it's great because it really fits in well within the story, right? Oh, many of us have seen these kind of experiences. I type in the date of birth, luckily, well, sometimes as an input field, as it should be, but on the Scottish Malt Whisky Society, you can type in 32nd day of 43rd month of 1547, and they still let you in because they know that you probably just want to get in, right? I mean, that's probably not legally compliant, but maybe instead of doing this, you could do this. This is a great example of just taking something that's extremely boring and flipping it all the way upside down, right? When on Austin Beer Works, they ask you a couple of questions, and depending of what you answer, just keeps going and going and going, and before you know it, you ended up in this, build your own adventure kind of thing on Austin Beer Works, which you did not expect at all, right? And that's just taking something as horrible as we think about it as a model or pop-up and flipping it upside down and making people fall in love with it. And I think that this is a really great example of taking something very simple, having a good idea in place, and flipping it all away to make it really funny to use, right? So this is absolutely wonderful and lovely. And so finally, this is also like, even if you think about a little toggle like this, you can make even people fall in love with the toggle. Remember, if somebody wants to sign up for your newsletter, maybe make it a bit harder for them to do that. Like this, right? Why not? Right? Maybe make people tap twice or 3 times or 4 times or 5 times so they desperately by the end really want to subscribe to the newsletter to expect what's going to happen when they actually do. So make them tap maybe 10 times or so, right? So all of that just to say, the world is not, we are at the Amuse conference, and it's a really wonderful conference where we're going to learn a lot of stuff about all kind of wonderful things that we can do to make interfaces better. There is a lot of frustration, though, that we need to fix, and the world, unfortunately as it is today, is unsatisfying. So this is the world in which we're living, and we still have the chance to make it much, much, much better. And the best part is, we kind of know how, we just need to do it. So this is the story of our world today. Let's make it a bit better. That's for designers out there. That's disappointing. Sorry for this. Thank you so much for Parallel Studio for the video. A wonderful, wonderful team of wonderful animators. Please hire them if you can. All right, with this in mind, no need to be sad. There are cats and friendly cats and meow. And thank you so much for listening. And I'm looking forward to your questions and to fixing all those frustrations on the web. It's about time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vitaly. Sorry, I'm still chuckling from some of those last examples. This was such a satisfying way to start this day. You're talking to a room full of people that I'm sure very much appreciate, and we're kind of just raging at the screen along with you. I hate when they do that. Oh, it's horrible when that happens. So you really got me impassioned.
Everywhere, it's everywhere. That's the kind of the sad part about it. I wish. I mean, but we'll get there. We'll get there. We'll make people fall in love with the web, I'm sure.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Well, you've done a really, really incredible job. Like, I guess gathering all of these different, perspectives and scenarios, and like just having this comprehensive list of things that we as designers can go through and use to reference as we're doing our own work. I know I was auditing myself a little bit while you were walking through some of those, thinking, oh, our product does that. Maybe I should go talk to them about fixing that. So got my own little to-do list going.
Yeah, there are plenty of
okay.
Yeah, just want to mention there are plenty of things that actually often go unnoticed. We just do that because we've been doing this for a long period of time. And I really try to question everything. I mean, this has kind of been my thing. I don't know, even if I read a book, right, I will question every single sentence that I read because it's not like because I don't trust them, right? But this really brings me to thinking. I need to start thinking, figure out, okay, is it really good this way? Is it not, right? And so that's always a good idea. Just always question everything in life. That's always
absolutely.
a good.
Why do we even do this? Why is this even a pattern?
Yeah, exactly. Why do we even need a navigation in the first place? So yeah,
absolutely. Love it. Flipping it on its head. Well, let's see here. We've got about 9 or 10 minutes. I got a couple of good questions queued up for you. First one, I'm particularly curious to hear. There's a whole lot in your talk that actually resonated really strongly with any sort of accessible type design that you're trying to design for accessibility, people with disabilities, things like that. So, I mean, how did you kind of fall into this? Did you have experience from that before? I think it's really cool because if you are designing for with accessibility in mind, you're actually already hitting a whole lot of these. So it's kind of like a win-win here, but I'm curious, how far you've kind of delved into that aspect as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Katie. Basically, it's been very interesting for me because I don't know, I designed my first website back in 1998 or 1999. And so I've been really jumping all over from front end to design to performance to accessibility and all kind of things in my life, just because I was really, really curious about so many different things in my life. But one thing that I learned really quickly is that accessibility is actually a very good gateway towards just creating good design. Right. And so for example, this is a big, me kind of being very frank here and all. I'm really bad with Sketch and Figma and Photoshop and all, really bad. I mean, horribly bad. I mean, everybody is much, much better than me. So I've figured out, so it doesn't really matter in the end what the button will appear like. Maybe the colors are important, and obviously we need to tap into psychology there and so on. But I'm really more into kind of creating these logical flows to eliminate any kind of ambiguity. Right? Everything needs to be absolutely perfectly crystal clear to ensure that nobody gets left out, everybody is picked up, and everybody can proceed to the point that they actually complete whatever task they wanted to complete. Right? So that's always been my thing. I would say 15 years ago, accessibility was kind of this little thing that you would have sitting somewhere on the side and you would not spend too much time on it. Maybe improve color contrast every now and again, but that would be it. And that's changed dramatically over the last 5, 7, 8 years, I guess, where we kind of got to this notion of inclusive design, which is design which includes everyone. And so this is why even think about these disabled buttons and excluding 3-4% of people just because a button is disabled, that's just a very expensive mistake to make for designers, for developers, for businesses, for everybody really, right? And so I started just looking and trying to figure out how can we make those things better. And as of now, I think, I sincerely believe so, at least in 2021, accessibility, if it's a new project, accessibility is going to be very much among the default considerations we'll have to keep in mind. And very often in my job, I go in and I kind of argue for accessibility just because it's a very important and very expensive thing not to do, right, at this point. And so I don't know, I just fell into it because I felt like this is a very good gateway into creating better solutions that work for everyone and kind of overall holistic things that actually will also be working for a long period of time. That's kind of the journey for me, at least.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. That's particularly interesting to me as well. Let's see here in our last couple minutes, I got another one here for you. What are some tips that you might have for ways that we can convince some of our peers or maybe our managers to prioritize actually going and attacking some of these different issues that may exist in the products or the web solutions, whatever it is that we're working on?
Absolutely. So I always do the same thing. I always ask for data about when do we have the lowest traffic, the absolutely lowest traffic. It might be Sunday evening, it might be Saturday morning. It depends on the kind of project or product you're working on and so on and so forth. I always need to create some sort of a case study, right? I cannot, I mean, I have, I mean, I don't think I've ever actually argued about, oh, we need to do this because it's usable, it's better for the users, right? Or for the customers, or it's more accessible this way. Because most of the time, I need to speak the language of the business or people who are making those decisions. So what I always ask is, the very first thing I do is I always go to the customer support to ask, what do people complain about, right? What are the typical things that the people complain about? I go to front-end developers or back-end developers and ask, what do you find most difficult in your work? Like, what are some of the technical debts that you have, and so on and so forth. I go to designers and I do the same thing. And I compile this list of most friction, I guess, in the product, things that are really need improvement. That's number one. Number two is I just try to come up with some sort of simple way to test my hypothesis. And that would be, let's add some link or something below the button and see what happens, right? This is really cheap to do. It doesn't cost you, it doesn't require a lot of development work, doesn't require a lot of design work. So I always try to find those low-hanging fruits first, right? And then I test them in the lowest traffic day that is provided to me, just to experiment. What happens if we do this for 4, 5, 6 hours? If it's a little bit less traffic, maybe 12 hours on a very low traffic day, and see what happens. And also conduct some usability interviews, usually 5 to 7, to see how people interact with it. Do they understand what it is in the first place? Once they see that this actually is useful, that opens the doors for me to do a little bit more, right? So in the beginning, it's always low-hanging fruit, something that's really easy to do for designers, for developers, doesn't require much effort, doesn't require much testing, right? And then if this works, I kind of give it a little bit more, I get more confidence from the management or from the C-level people to maybe try a bit more, and then we try a bit more. But I always need to keep in mind that I cannot just say, oh, this is going to look better. I always need to speak the language. That means I need to know what they care about. What KPIs do they care about? What metrics do they track? And I try to frame my decisions or my experiments as a way to improve those metrics, right, along the way. And hopefully, I mean, it doesn't work all the time, but hopefully some of those things that are better for users, especially like if you think about this disabled button again, they will bring more revenue. There is no question about that. This is just, this is a fact, because if people can't continue, hell, they cannot continue. The question is how many people are left out, and some people will always be. And so I try to find that little small thing that they can improve, and then this opens the doors for me.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Nope. I think you're absolutely right. Couldn't agree more. Starting with some of those baby steps, and who can argue with some really great user data to say this is why we should be doing something. I'm sure it is astonishing how much revenue is lost because of small decisions that would maybe discourage you from finishing a sign up or kind of product flow like that. All right, well, I've got one more question for you, just kind of a fun one. Before I do that, I wanted to make sure, I think we will have a poll popping up here shortly. We want to know how super exciting and helpful you thought VITALY's talk was for us today. So keep an eye on that tab, kind of shows up right next to the chat and the Q&A. And here in our last 2 minutes, VITALY, funny question. So I hear the grapevine that you love ironing and coffee. Would you like to tell me more about this?
Yeah, so I mean, we all have been doing something, I guess, last year. And so I tried to improve and refine my skills in making coffee. And I think I'm proud to say that I'm very happy with my coffee. I'm actually more happy with my coffee than compared to coffee shops around the corner. So that counts for something. I mean, at least me. And I did improve my ironing skills, I must say, a little bit. I wouldn't say much, but I am exploring the fine art of ironing. And so if you need any ironing, maybe we should get in touch and I can get it done for you. I think
you're talking about like ironing your clothes, right?
Sure, it's clothing, yes, because it's like meditation for me. I know that for some people it's yoga, for other people it's just, I don't know, walking in the park. For me, ironing. Katie, it's ironing. It's always ironing. I think that more people should iron. The world would be a better place.
From a Zen perspective. Yes. Great for a pandemic too. You only have to iron the top half. No one can see.
I do both. Even
what
socks,
your pants
actually.
look like.
No, it goes all the way. I mean, yeah, it needs to be done.
Great. All right. Well, yes. So definitely, whenever that poll pops up, take a look at that, folks. And then wanted to say thank you so much to you, VITALY, for coming and talking to us about this. This was super, super exciting and interesting to me. You already